If you gaze downwards at your shoes too long, you either see yourself becoming the traditional introvert or a shoegaze player. An introvert who can make a good excuse to why they're staring down at their shoes for long periods of times. In this episode of Don't Let Me Into My Zone, we take a look at 10 records created by shoegazers that stared so long at their shoes gazed back at them with a shroud of obscurity. Let's get this started.
Don't let him into his zone. Don't let him into his zone. You just let him into his music nerd zone.
Well, aside from that intro trying to make this episode of Don't Let Me Into My Zone sound more grand, the specific gist of this review is just taking a look at my top 10 obscure, esoteric, elameric shoegaze albums of all time. What influenced me to make this review is a record you'll see around the top spots, but truly, this is just to flaunt a few shoegaze records I think have the perfect sound and aesthetic I always imagined the genre having since the first time I heard it. Most people nowadays may see it as a genre for lonely romantics, and the walls of sound coming from the guitars as a comforting, warm blanket of nostalgia as lyrics of an unrequited love are sang. But to me, shoegaze was always a genre that represented the feelings of ascending into the infinite vastness of space or descending into the infinite unknown of the ocean. The walls of sound coming from the guitars representing the vast atmospheres such environments contain. And with that, we'll start off this review with the entry number 10. And to start off this review with number 10, we have Ariel Love Beat self-titled. And first thing I heard this record, I was almost surprised to know it was released in the 2010s and recorded from that time period. It sounds like it came from the same batch the whole electronic shoegaze combo wave from the 90s came from. But you know what? It's not a bad thing. Like with many other of those releases in a similar vein, Ariel Love Beat provides an hour worth of electronic beats mixed with fuzzy warms of sound from guitars and echoing vocals from your speakers from Ariel Love Beat. I only said this because of the album cover. And with entry number 9, we will be doing Okina's Hakenshu. Back in the 90s, electronic music and shoegaze gave birth to the first combo of bliss that goes into a different sense of ascension and ethereality. As the decades passed and from Japan, the electronic side of music birthed the singing voice synthesizer software Vocaloid, which most of you would know because of Hatsune Miku and her friends. Most people would get to know Vocaloid for more of the traditional hyper J-pop you hear a lot if you got your hands on the PC version of Hatsune Miku Project Diva Mega Mix Plus on Steam recently. But the closest you would get to rock guitars paired with her synthetic voice would be with Wowaka, rest in peace. But what if I told you, during the later 2000s and 2010s, there were a handful of Vocaloid producers that came together to create the Loveless Killer. Aside from how I still say Mika Gazer Volume 1 is still one of the best shoegaze albums of all time, we'll refrain from that rant and my feelings due to this video focusing on a more obscure release. That being our current entry. Okina is a producer that also dabbled in the whole Vocaloid gaze scene. Yes, I might as well make up terms for super niche subgenres just for the sake of appearing more nerdy for these music reviews. But this album right here leans into more of that aggressive J-rock sound with post-hardcore undertones, alongside with walls of sound coming both from the shoegazing aspect and the Vocaloid vocals. It just makes me happy to know that the Vocaloid gaze scene even exists. Yeah, I know you're all gonna say, yo, MB, you're reaching really hard for entry number 8, you know, because you were trying to do this whole obscure shoegaze video, but then you decide to put an EP by one of the gods of shoegaze. That I only found out because of this review. Is it because most people tend to ignore EPs unless they get bored one day or they just decide to make a music research video like I did? But aside from that, this EP from Ride, called Coming Up for Air, takes on the styling that almost every space rock jam band does. Except it's Ride, one of the gods of shoegaze. That sadly fell off after their well-known albums. They did it, and I must say, despite hearing this type of jamming a lot of times with jam bands in the space rock scene, knowing a band like Ride did it is really something worth listening to. Sure, the first 2 sound checks have abrupt endings, but as soon as you get into the main performance, cause that's literally the name of the track. On a CP, you get a taste of how it sounds like when legends of Shoegaze jam out. Entry number 7, spearheaded by one of the most well-known musicians in an electronic blend of shoegaze, Scott Cortez's Polychromance, rather fine. He's more well known for his other electro-gaze projects such as Love Lies Crashing and Transstellar, and also responsible for the term bliss gaze. Yes, I know there's a lot of terms in gaze. On this project, he takes on more of the nature that Love Lies Crashing contains, ambience and flows on top of the ethereal shoegaze walls of sounds, as a bit of ambient techno beats accompanies the otherworldly soundscapes. A lot of people tend to say Scott Cortez's projects never miss, and this is a great example of that. From ethereal walls of sound created from musicians looking down at their electronic boards, or like guitarists looking down at their pedals, it's truly a heavenly combo. Entry number 6 will be hailing from the Czech Republic like the Naked Souls did, from this European country birthing many wonderful shoegaze obscurities, while the Naked Souls took on the dreamy nature of shoegaze that would aid the listener to sleep. This simply named band here took on the more grungy alternative rock influence that we hear from a lot of 90s shoegaze bands from the American side of the genre. One thing I have to confirm is that here still contains that dreamy wall of sound one could sleep to, and many of the songs on this album, a good example of that is like Flower Rain. With a name like that, I'm not surprised it harbors a dreamy atmosphere. Before we move on to the next entry, despite this sounding alike to many other 90s shoegaze releases, it's truly an obscurity worth your time, and this is another record that proves shoegaze is the perfect genre for anyone with a heavy accent, because all you really need to do is use your vocals to add to the wall of sound. Entry number 5, a well-kept secret from the American side of shoegaze. Blue Chev's single almost sounds like something of the jangle pop-natured shoegaze bands from Europe when I first heard this, but you know what? I still must say some of the guitar lines and soundscapes created on this charming album makes it more than just a simple, jangly, dreaming sounding shoegaze record. It stands into its own plane of existence, into its own 7 natural scenes. Get it? Album title. Aside from that, having that humorous World Runner meep meep at the end of the album, it's really nice. Entry number 4 has me staring on the night sky, a single star in the sky bright enough to accompany you in a dark, lonely night, imagining the journey one would partake to reach that star. This is what this album is to me. Bernard Starr, self-titled. I know the 90s had a lot of space rock shoegaze combo craze that a lot of people would know of, well, due to Flying Saucer Attack, but Bernard Starr's self-titled record is probably the perfect representation of space gaze. Yes, we're gonna even make more of that. As Aquanova's In Heaven, which you'll find, which is pretty high up in this list, was both a soundscape encapsulating the experience of being beneath the waves and above the heavens. Bernard Starr is the journey of going through space to reach a single star light years away. Through its droning guitars and ethereal walls of sound, the journey is a long one, but it's a beautiful one at that, reaching a single star in the vast cosmos. And we finally reached the top 3, and what would you have guessed? Number 3 has been used as the TV display this whole review, and it's on Primary Industries Ultramarine. I mean, this release isn't as obscure as the other ones that we had in this review. I mean, yeah, I know I did put Ride in this review, but we'll ignore that for now. The only reason for this release not being as obscure as the others is due to the fact that it has taken on the mantle of being one of the first shoegaze releases of all time. And once you listen to it, you can kind of see why. As for me, I already knew that post-punk was a precursor to many rock genres we have today, but as soon as I heard this record, I was mostly enticed by the album name and cover. They match each other beautifully, and you know me being a big fan of anything water related, why do you think Arya is one of my favorite anime of all time, right? As soon as I played the record, I heard a few familiar trends that I would hear with post-punk music during this age, but it took on more of a unique approach with some elements. With the industrial aspect of the music, it made some of those dance punk aesthetic bass lines sound even more atmospheric, and more heavy, taking on almost an aquatic approach. But when does the shoegaze aspect come in? Well, with the power of ether wave being mixed in with the experimentation and industrial, plus that saxophone a lot of bands during this time loved using, you got yourself the shoegaze wall of sound. It's pretty amazing hearing something like this before the whole genre blew up, but you know, it always got me a bit giddy knowing one of my favorite genres of all time, post-punk, eventually led to the foundation of shoegaze. The bounds and experimentation in the genre were limitless, and eventually led to many of the genres we love today. Entry number 2 has me realizing that shoegaze tends to overuse the word sleep. But you know what? Despite all that in nature, I want to say that the Naked Souls 2-in-1, which is probably one of the most interesting cases of people finding out about Chechian shoegaze band and the scene from there due to some random MTV music video showcase during the 90s. But you know what? The Naked Souls took the word sleep and used it to create one of the greatest shoegaze songs of all time. Sleep is probably one of the songs I would want to listen to before I close my eyes for eternity. But I want to say, it's just amusing to me to know how the Czech Republic was one of the few countries in Europe that had a shoegaze scene boom back in the 90s, and the one time people found out about it was through this band, and through the fact that MTV showed them through their MTV Europe's 120 Minutes with Paul King for the music video for the same song, which you can find on YouTube right now. Sometimes it makes me wish that I could have found out about this band and one of my favorite songs of all time from that show rather than just digging through the radio music charts like some music gremlin. But let me tell you something, the fact that I was that music gremlin and digging through those charts is the one reason why we have entry number 1, and the entry responsible for the fact that this music review is even an episode for the Don't Let Me Into My Zone series. So let's get it started. Oh, you didn't see entry number 1 coming, right? Well, thanks to Bernard Starr, honestly, this isn't surprising. I did mention it during that. But you know what? This record did influence me to create this review, and Heaven's Aquanova is entry number 1. It's the perfect representation of the idea of what shoegaze represents, my idea of it, which I mentioned during the intro of this review. The band's name being the space aspect, while the whole record itself is a mix of being beneath the great waves or being above the stars in heaven. Aside from that, I will say, for a record made in the 90s, a lot of shoegaze during this time had an interesting phase. Like some of the earlier entries, some of them tried mixing in the nature of electronic music during the 90s, or some of them just went out full on space rock. I would say this record is the latter. And why is it so high on this list? With this band being so obscure and all, the recording itself isn't really hi-fi like you would hear with a lot of shoegaze releases, like your whole music Discord full of zoomers love. But the lo-fi nature of the songs really do add more to the ethereal soundscapes this record has, even to the mysterious nature of this record. Shout out to these fellas, just knowing that this is the early studio album they released, and nothing much more is known of them outside of this cassette being released in '93 in the UK. It's truly the embodiment of obscure shoegaze. I highly recommend this to be your first step into the world of obscure shoegaze, and that's why it's entry number 1. With that has been this episode of Don't Let Me Into My Zone music review series done by yours truly, the busiest internet music nerd VTuber, me. Even if there's been many musicians that have been lost in the gaze while looking at their shoes and guitar pedals, I would say despite the massive influx of shoegaze since its birth, I wanted to create this review since there's a lot to look beyond the surface that almost every music nerd tends to praise to high heavens. Not to rag on him, it's a good thing, since even the most well-known releases are as godly as the shoegaze releases lost in obscurity. But aside from that, this review was to compile the obscurities that I found that got me lost in their gaze and walls of sound, works that represent the marine and space beauty I desire whenever listening to shoegaze. So I'm glad that I could share my favorite obscure shoegaze records with you all through this music review. And I hope you can get lost in the gaze of these releases too. If you'd like to see more of this content, along with future music reviews, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll do my best with these reviews despite my lazy, talentless potato nature. But for sure, the next review will be worth it, cause while doing some digging for this review and the shoegaze obscurities, I found a good old blog spot discussing the history of post-rock. And you know my fave post-rock has always been the earliest releases, so who knows, maybe the next Don't Let Me Into My Zone music review series will be based off that. Anyhow, hope you all have a wonderful day. OFFICIALL, bye!